Hey guys, how's it going? Jason Sensational here. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to have a little bit more of a discussion sort of video. This was something in the topics. This is something that they released in their roadmaps, and now this is something that they're diving a little bit deeper into, and that is rotation coming to Legends of Runeterra. And I believe as of now, the plan is for rotation to come in later this year. So they let out a lot of information on some of the thoughts and why they or how they want to approach rotation, and I thought I'd take the time to kind of read over it together with you guys, give my thoughts, and kind of get your thoughts as well on the topic, because I know for some it is a little bit touchier than others. But anyways, let's begin. So just on a very high level, their plan for rotation is more so something like what Hearthstone is doing. They're going to have two formats, a standard and an eternal format, much like the standard and wild format that Hearthstone sees. I might reference Hearthstone a lot because I came from playing Hearthstone. So if you guys haven't, just bear with me. But so in standard, it's going to be the card pools that have all the cards that aren't rotated out, and then eternal is all the cards overall, right? So anything that gets rotated out from standard is playable in eternal, but you can't play them in standard for a certain amount of time period. Looks like they say once a year, which is honestly a little bit longer than I had expected. Maybe I was thinking like twice a year, but it's a problem. I don't know if it's still work in progress, but I don't know how much you can take this for what's written down. But anyways, that's just what their plan is right now. Next section here is why they want to approach rotation, and they got a few points here. So the first things first is a little bit on limiting the card excuse me, limiting the card pool in standard, and this makes it easier overboard or overall for them to do a few things. So when they want to print new cards, it's easier to predict where they're going to fall into the meta, because right now when you have all the champions are all the card pools, every time they release a new card, they have to plan around so many different things, whether or not it works with this champion or not works with these sets of cards, and it becomes a lot hard to balance, which is a lot of what points 1 is talking about, and a little bit on just overall play testing and a little bit on design space as well. And overall, I think this is reasonable, given the fact that it's a lot harder to predict when you have like 80 something champions, and maybe if you rotate that pool down to like 50 60, then there's a lot less things you have to worry about. And the second point is design space, which I think is also something that I generally agree with. One thing when they're trying to print new cards is it's hard to print new cards that are both very playable, without also making other cards less playable. And this comes to the topic of power creep, where if you print a card that's too strong, it makes old cards irrelevant, but if you print it too weak, then your expansion kind of sucks because nobody wants to play the new cards. And I think these points are relatively valid. I think almost any card game has this sort of issue, and something that I definitely noticed within Hearthstone, where they took advantage of having the rotation system to continually print out stronger and stronger cards with every set, without, you know, swamping the standard format to make things like too bad. Then they get to some points down here that I think is where the discussion kind of kicks in, and this is really around balancing some of the less played champions. And this is where things definitely get a little bit interesting. So the first point here is underappreciated champions have a rougher time reaching playability. Some champs like Udyr have cool gameplay dreams or promote interesting new deck building choices, but in a crowded metagame, these champs don't have a chance to shine. Rotation provides a new environment for these champions to try new champion pairings, explore combinations of lower powered cards that improve synergy, and more. Overall, I think that this one is okay. So imagine if, so say right now, you have Twisted Fate, right? Twisted Fate is really core in a lot of aggro / tempo strategies, such as TF Swain, TF MF, TF Nami, things like that. And that's not to say that these decks don't have better or like other pairings besides Twisted Fate. It's just the fact that Twisted Fate is the best pairing for all these decks, that it sort of limits the boundaries of what people are willing to experiment and push with, because they're going to put in a lot of effort to get a result that's worse than what they could do if they just played with Twisted Fate, right? And if they were to rotate out Twisted Fate, then all of a sudden you just can't play Twisted Fate with your Nam. You can't play Twisted Fate with your Swain. And now they have to go back to like Annie Swain or something like that, right? Or some new champion or things like that. And while Udyr I think is a little bit of like it's much hard. The analogy doesn't quite work with Udyr, but say a champion like Quinn was rotated out and now you can't play scouts with MF Quinn. Maybe it's like, I don't know, sometime maybe in the future it's like MF Jarvan, right? Something like that. That gives some other champions a little bit more time in the spotlight if they're like the next best option. And this can just continually to evolve what the decks and champion pairings look like in a standard format. And yeah, like Udyr, imagine if Trundle didn't exist in Freljord, then like Udyr, you know, might be able to fill the gaps in some more like mid-range kind of decks. It's just like a hypothetical example. But overall, I do agree with this sentiment. Just because in some decks there are just overwhelmingly powerful champions that you don't really want to not play. But if those didn't exist, you might play some other things, right? Like Nami Nora was a thing for a bit before everyone found out that Nami like Lee Sin or Nami TF in Ionia was just a much better pairing. And if you kind of take away those restrictions, then you can have a little bit more experimentation between some of the other champions that might see a little bit less play. Now here's where things I think I get a little bit harder to agree with. The first one is playtesting and tech quality, keeping bugs down becomes significantly harder. I mean, yes, that's true. That's the same thing with like designing new cards. When you have to plan for so many different things, it's much harder to catch like, you know, these interactions that don't really happen. I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with this. It's like completely factual and just what happens when you have a higher card pool. But if they want to also keep the Eternal format at a high quality, then this is still something that's still high on the relevance chart. Now, maybe they have a team for Standard and then a team for Eternal. So then now they're splitting like their time looking at interactions in different formats. And then maybe that leads to a higher standard of quality within Standard itself, which maybe is a plus. But in a game like this, where, or at least even in a like a brand or like like a, with Riot overall, when you have like the league and like everyone's attachment to like specific champions and things like that, then this point kind of falls a little bit through, because, well, you don't want your champion to have bugs with interactions with these specific cards when you want to specifically play that champion in Eternal because it was rotated out of Standard, right? So it's this point's definitely a little bit trickier. It makes sense if you only think about it in terms of Standard, because obviously the smaller your card pool size is, the fewer interactions that have a higher chance of becoming bugs or things like that. But if you want to keep the Eternal format at a same level of quality, then this point doesn't really make sense, right? And that's like where I think things get tough, because later on I think they do mention that they want both formats to be have some sort of rank system. It's probably Standard's probably gonna be the competitive, quote unquote competitive format, but there are like rank systems there in both. And the issue with like in Hearthstone is that in Wild it becomes a lot harder. It just like you just push all the issues that you had with Standard into Wild, because now you still have to test all the same things. You have even more things as the game progresses, because Eternal just continues to grow without a cap. So this is a little bit trickier, but I mean, overall, these points understand the sentiment. Last one is good balance targets become harder to achieve without effectively rotating cards. We want to provide new puzzle for you to solve by providing new puzzles very difficult with large card pools full of equivalent replacements. This is easiest to see the low cost staples. There's not a lot of room to change these numbers, and there are not a lot of very similar cards we use to replace them if we nerf some of them. So if we nerf all the relevant cards, it would have the same effect as rotation. However, with rotation, we can have a format that can support those cards that can remain playable for players who truly enjoy them. This is, I think, quite a relevant point. Some people were saying, why not, instead of rotating cards, we just nerf them? And this is where I think also leaks into the design area space. Ruben said on stream, on one of his streams rather, when the idea of design space came up, it was if you wanted to design a new 1-drop card for Bilgewater or for Noxus, how would you design it without making it unplayable and not overplayed, or like not super like overpowered? And that's where things get hard, right? You can't just design like a 4-1 with no keywords. You can't just design a 3-1 with fearsome, right? Like those just are blatant power creep, but makes it hard for you to either design a new card like that or to introduce new cards, because either it's going to just automatically replace a card or it's going to not be played because existing cards are just stronger than that, right? And now, say we have like a card like, I don't know what a good example is. A card like Mystic Shot, whatever. Instead of nerfing Mystic Shot, we can rotate it where people can still play Mystic Shot, but we can introduce a new card into Standard that can fill in the space of Mystic Shot, but potentially introduce new mechanics that do different things. And I think overall rotation just makes this approach cleaner, because you don't have to continually nerf cards as you print cards. You can simply rotate them and then print out new cards. And whereas in the Eternal format, you can have this hodgepodge of like power spike cards. And overall, I think that is easier on design space. Whether or not that makes Eternal like a good format is a little bit to be speculated. It just becomes, again, super hard for you to have a very healthy Eternal format. But at the very least, you have a healthy Standard format, or at least interesting, continually evolving Standard format and things like that. Now, I will say that I think that they have had some approaches to this that don't necessarily have to go through like rotation. So a good example of this, I think, very recently is their approach to Leona, where they kind of reworked her and the entire Daybreak package and then reintroduced her into the meta, where I think she's actually just decent. But when it comes to like making cards strong or giving cards buffs, it's not all of them that are going to shine, even though they are receiving buffs because of the meta that they're kind of in. Because right now, Nocturne got recently buffed, but he's not actually that good into cards like Nami, into anything that's not specifically like some sort of Ionia decks. And it's hard to buff cards and make them shine when there's so many other things that kind of push down on it and potentially can be solved by rotation. I mean, this is all just like hypothetical, but overall it just becomes easier to have a healthier, smaller format like Standard. But that doesn't necessarily solve the fact that we have the Eternal format that still is maybe messy. And now here's where they get to the champions, because I think this is the one that is definitely a little bit higher in contention. Because when you rotate a card, I think like hypothetically rotating a card like Flock is actually really, really cool, because Flock has been a staple for a lot of decks in the past. And it's hard to print a card that's stronger than Flock. And it's kind of pointless to print a card that's weaker than Flock. If you can rotate Flock out and introduce a new card into that still synergize in a very similar spot that Flock has, then all of a sudden you can have newer design space to print out new cards like that. But again, when you have something like this game that's so focused on champions, rotating out champions is where things get, a little bit dicier, just because of how much people care about playing their specific champions. Me, I like Yasuo, I like Leona, I like my Zillion, I like my Nasus. I have a lot of champions I like, and I would not be very happy if my champion was unplayable in a Eternal format if it gets rotated out for a year, right? For example. So they're talking over a few things here, and they actually confirmed that these are champions that they're intending to rotate out in the first rotation next year. That's next year. I thought it was this year, but it's next year. And they have 3 champions here. So Aurelia. So so I guess the 3 champions first of all are Aurelia, Twisted Fate, and Vladimir, and they list out some reasons that definitely do tie into some earlier ones. So the first one is Aurelia. So right now Aurelia is pretty much only played with Azir, and it makes it hard to play an Azir deck that's not Azir Aurelia, because Aurelia and Blade Dance is likely the strongest thing you can do with Azir, and the Deus cards, right? The Sand Soldier cards. Now, we have seen Azir played in some more aggressive burn kind of strategy decks, but that's only really using Azir and not really any of the other the Sand Soldier cards, like Dune Keeper, Deus, Emperor's Divide, things like that. You get the point. And so by hopefully rotating Azir, rotating Aurelia, they can either introduce a new champion that works with Azir, or oh, I see. It gives room to make relevant Azir cards without needing to think how to interact with Blade Dance cards. I think this is like completely valid, right? Every time they print out a new Azir card, they have to think, is this going to be broken with Aurelia? And now they don't. And that allows them to print out more support cards in order to get Azir out of that group with Aurelia, from Ionia, from Blade Dance. And maybe you can do something like free attacks in Bilgewater. You can do something like rallies in Demacia. You can do other things that have synergy with Azir, with the attacks, that isn't tied specifically to Blade Dance itself. And you can make that stronger because now you can print out more cards for Azir. And then in Internal, you can have a super strong Azir Aurelia deck because you still have access to all the cards there. And I think that is definitely a valid reason to introduce something like rotation. So I think something like sort of relevant-ish, or at least like the way they're kind of approaching things, I would say is like, say they recently changed how the Ripper's Bay card works. And that is introducing a way to try to pull Pike outside of Lurk, right? Or specifically Rek'Sai. They changed how Nocturne works. So now he can be played in a more fearsome decks, and that's tying him out of like Diana, right? So I think like overall, like that's generally an okay idea. But again, like they still have to worry about this in the Eternal format. And when it comes to like having to balance Eternal format, that's where things is like kind of cannon worms. It's like if you don't consider how these cards work together just because it doesn't affect the standard format, you're going to create this like super like hyper insane Aurelia Azir deck in Eternal, and maybe the Eternal decks can't really deal with that. Or maybe it becomes so polarizing that other rotated champions just don't really have a chance into it. And now, even though you want to play your champion in the Eternal format, you really can't deal with it here. Next one is Twisted Fate. And this is, I've already talked about this in length. Twisted Fate is the strongest champion in so many different decks. If you nerf him, then, well, Twisted Fate loses a lot of what's, like, as they say, iconic about him. Because overall, Twisted Fate's one of the best designed champions in the game. But it's just like every time new better card draw is printed, it's just introducing new ways of breaking him. And again, if you rotate out Twisted Fate, other champions get other time in other decks with champion pairings as well, like in Pirates, in Nami decks, and whatever, right? Third one is Vlad. So they're rotating out Vlad for a much more interesting reason. So Vlad right now is too weak, doesn't work with this region, and they want to rework change Vlad in the future. So they're going to rotate him out in order to rework him and bring him back in, which I think is super interesting, because with the idea of rotation, they're not banishing specific champions and cards into Eternal forever. which I think is a super cool approach, because in Hearthstone it kind of is just a one-way track where once that card leaves standard, it never comes back unless it's part of like the core set, which is like a semi like rotating set. But cards from like a specific expansion that aren't tied to the like the classic set, I forgot if I called it something differently, but just don't come back. And I think that their approach to wanting to bring champions in and out to kind of change how the meta looks is, I think, very cool. But this reason's a little bit more interesting. The rotating out specifically to bring him back in later, which you don't necessarily need to do as like what they've seen with Leona, but I think overall this idea still fits, because maybe they want to bring him back in when they rotate Nami out. So say, let's hypothetically say Nami crushes Vlad. So next rotation, they don't rotate out Nami, but they rotate out Vlad. So now in standard, Vlad, there's no Vlad Nami thing anymore. But then the next rotation, they're going to rotate out Nami, bring Vlad back in. And now Vlad doesn't have to compete against one of its worst matchups, hypothetically again. And now you can rework him into a smaller pool of champions where he has a higher chance of shining, because now he doesn't have to fight for or fight against the whole pool of champions anymore. And it can make him into it makes it easier for you to design a stronger version of Vladimir without, breaking the restraints of having to worry about every single champion that interacts with Vlad, right? So I think that like these are some like quite valid reasons. Like rotation overall, I'm not a opponent against, because I think that it makes it easier, it makes things more fresh, and you get to experiment a lot more with how things work. Like things that I could be excited for is, hypothetically, if they rotate out like something like Katarina, which is Yasuo's best component, they can introduce now better Yasuo support cards that could make him viable in other regions, or B, strong with other champions. But I think overall the issue is just the Eternal format, right? It's very easy to kind of sweep everything under the rug and make the Eternal format just a mess, hodgepodge of overpowered decks and cards and interactions that, just because you don't see them in the standard format, doesn't mean that they don't exist, right? And so in the future, standard, I think, is mostly just going to be what we see now. There's going to be the rank queue, seasons, gauntlet, tournament support, and most certainly the competitive format. But their idea for Eternal, they're going to have a spotlight on the format alongside of it. So they have rank queue and seasons as well. We're spotlighting Eternal. We'll make sure to give equivalent high level competitive support. This is very interesting, because in Hearthstone, Wild has no real competitive support, but they want to introduce competitive for both standard and Eternal, which I guess makes sense, because if you want to play a specific champion and you want to be competitive, well, you can do that. But again, so the issue now here is that like they want to have a competitive Eternal format, which means it needs to be balanced to a certain degree, which means that they're also going to still face the same issues in the Eternal format as they are going to have if they didn't introduce rotation at all, which is weird to say, because that means that they have to introduce more resources, more balanced team, whatever it may be. And hopefully that's the case, because that means the game's growing. But right now, rotation is always compelling, but if they want to have a competitive Eternal format, I think that's where you're going to see a few more issues. Simply because, again, you're going to run into the same problems that you had if you didn't introduce rotation at all, because Eternal is that format, right? So very curious. Overall, I do like rotation because it makes the standard format, I think, better overall. But I am slightly worried about what Eternal is going to look like, and hopefully Riot is able to, or the team behind Play Runeterra, and keep a better hand over the Eternal format. And maybe it'll be a nice win-win overall for everybody, where you can play your favorite decks, but they still get stronger cards. Like your decks overall, your favorite decks, if they get rotated out, are probably going to be stronger in the Eternal format if they get new cards to support. So overall, it seems it's all in like good faith and here and there, because they're being super open about it. They even told like what champions are like they're rotating out, and I guess a lot of the reasoning behind what they're doing is making a lot of sense. So I'm cheering for them. And rotation, I'm very excited to see what kind of comes out of it. But let me know what you guys do think on any of the points made by the dev team. I will link the full article down in the description if you guys want to read it for yourselves. If you guys have come from a card game that had rotation, feel free to drop your experiences down below as well as kind of what formats you typically enjoyed playing. But I'll go leave it here. Thank you guys for tuning into the video, and we'll resume your gameplay tomorrow. So thank you guys. Hope you guys are having a lovely Saturday, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace out, guys. Have a good one.